I was talking, we're seeing pictures from the Turkish capital, Ankara, where there is a jet there on the runway. Let's go to DC and bring in James Matthews. So, James, look, why do we think this has come about now?
Principally because the Russians want it, Kamali. They clearly will receive Russians in return as their part of this deal. And there's every chance that that will include people, individuals that they would consider high value, like Vadim Krasikov, who has been serving a jail sentence in Germany, having committed murder. An FSB agent killed somebody who fought the Russian forces. Vladimir Putin said that his crime was to liquidate a bandit, but he's clearly very close to the Russian regime, somebody that they would seek the return of. But in terms of the timing right now, I think we'll look at the number of countries involved. The United States will have been at the very heart of that, and of course the personnel will change in the Oval Office come November. So a deal stitched together by President Joe Biden would be at risk of unravelling, perhaps, and Russians might have seen a danger in that. In terms of the American names in the frame, Evan Gershkovich, as Ivor pointed out, Paul Whelan. There's also a journalist, a Russian-American national who was arrested last year, was serving 6 years. Her name is Alsu Kurmasheva. So these are the Americans that are being looked at by the United States. And of course, I'm standing here in the White House. Evan Gershkovich is a colleague of those who report from here. His poster is up in the press room. It says, "Journalism is not a crime, bring him home." Gershkovich and Whelan, perhaps, the faces of American hostages being held abroad. They carry an air, or have carried an air, of hopelessness, despair. It would appear that that is all about to change. A result for Joe Biden, of course, given the timing, given that he is on his way out of the door. He is an individual who has had a personal stake and been personally invested in achieving the return of American hostages. I was at the White House Correspondents' Dinner last year. The parents of Evan Gershkovich were the guests of honour, and they were told, asked to stand by the president, and he said that journalism is not a crime. I will do everything in my power to bring your son home. It won't go unnoticed by Joe Biden and the Biden-Harris campaign that Donald Trump, for weeks and months now, has been promising that one of his first acts in office would be to secure the release of Evan Gershkovich. Everything plays into the politics here.
It certainly does. All right, James, for now. reported, according to Turkish officials. That's the reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Evan Gershkovich, along with Paul Whelan, who's a former US Marine, and others, have now been exchanged as part, as we say, of this ongoing prisoner exchange between Russia and a number of Western nations. Our Security and Defence Editor, Deborah Haynes, is here with us now for some more on this. So, look, Deb, it was suggested this was going to be happening. We were waiting for the moment for it to begin. We can see that is, we think, one of the jets that are carrying some of these people on the tarmac in the Turkish capital, Ankara. Just give us a sense of how big a moment this is now in this prisoner exchange.
It's extraordinary, huge moment. It's very significant. It's got sort of the echoes of the Cold War when we had these prisoner exchanges, these spy swaps. Like the largest known prisoner exchange was back in 1985, and that involved 29 individuals. I mean, potentially this could be even bigger. The last big one that we had in the post-Cold War era was in 2010, when you'll remember there were 10 Russians that had been detained by the United States for spying, including Anna Chapman, and they were exchanged for 4 individuals, including a name that viewers will recognise, Sergei Skripal, the Russian double agent who worked for MI6 and was then attacked in 2018 with a Novichok poison. So even though the exchange happens, the sort of the hostilities might continue. But this is a very significant moment, and clearly both sides wanting to get their people back and willing to negotiate, even though this is a period of extreme hostilities.
And what's it tell us about the sort of the balance of those that are being held and those that are being exchanged? I mean, we are expecting there to be Russians held in the US exchanged as well, and some of those that are being held there, are accused of having provided American-made munitions and electronics to the Russian military, accused of huge frauds and thefts of sort of $93 billion. And, on the other side, we've got journalists and activists being exchanged. What does that tell us about the imbalance between the two sides?
Well, and also an individual detained in Germany who was found guilty of killing someone in a Berlin park. I mean, these are very, very serious crimes on the one hand, and then on the other, it's dissidents that have spoken out against the Russian regime, and, like you say, journalists, innocent civilians who are being used as pawns. Obviously, Russia accusing Evan Gershkovich of spying, which has been categorically denied by the US, by his employer. So it is a dangerous time, but again, echoes of the Cold War, where the two sides are using all different means to fight each other.
Yeah. Deb, stay with us for a second. I want to bring in Sir Andrew Wood, former British ambassador to Russia. Sir Andrew, thanks very much for being with us this afternoon. Your thoughts initially as we think that this prisoner exchange is underway?
I was at first, when I heard about it, rather suspicious, but evidently it is on the way. And for those being released and their families and so on, of course it is a good thing. On the other hand, the difference between those we assume the Russians want in exchange, they are people of very doubtful morality and people who are hostile to us in general. The people that are being sent back to the United States anyway are people who are not guilty of anything at all. They were seized as pawns, as people that you could use and exploit. I think that is not a good thing at all, because if you're not careful, you end up with a bit of an industry when the Russians will seize more people and release them when the price is okay in terms of Russians being released.
Well, Sir Andrew, I mean, what is the price then at the moment? Why do we think it's happening at this point now with these people who, in many cases have been held for a number of years? Of course, Gershkovich has just been sentenced, but these people have been held for a period of time.
Yes, honestly enough, oddly enough, Gershkovich was very recently handed a further sentence, so he's lucky to get out. I think because the Russians know perfectly well that they are not spies, they are not people who are acting against Russia. They are people who have been seized for use. which is very much the same they do to their own population too. I was very sorry to hear that Kara-Murza was not mentioned as being released. He is a man of huge goodness, a man of loyalty to the Russian people, and a man who is also extremely sick. But it apparently is the case that he will be kept in prison and maltreated there. He's already been poisoned twice. So he may face a more Navalny fate than the others. I hope not, but he may.
Sir Andrew, just very briefly, Deborah Haynes here. Do you think that the fact that the West has been willing to exchange prisoners in this way, it could actually raise the risk for foreign nationals in Russia at the moment, that they too could be used as pawns?
Certainly. Certainly, I do. Perhaps not straight away, but there's no rule of law in Russia, and no rule of law which is used by or obeyed by Putin and people like that.
OK. Sir Andrew, thank you very much for that. And Deborah Haynes, of course, thanks both. We'll keep across these stories. The prisoner exchange is underway. We understand Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal journalist, has been freed as a part of it. And in the next hour, we're going to be live in Downing Street. on scene. The misinformation online led to protests following the attack in Southport on Monday. Now, in the last hour, Turkey, the Turkish state has reported that the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich is to be freed as part of what is thought to be the largest prisoner exchange since the end of the Cold War between Russia and the West. Officials in Turkey say that 10 prisoners, including 2 children, have been sent to Russia, while 13 people have gone to Germany and 3 to the United States. Now, the Wall Street Journal, the employer of Evan Gershkovich, who was jailed in Russia just in the last few months on espionage charges, have tweeted in the last few minutes. And here it is. It says, breaking, of course, Russia freed wrongly convicted WSJ reporter Evan Gershkovich as part of the largest and most complex East-West prisoner swap since the Cold War. Evan Gershkovich, of course, who has his employer and the US State Department always said that Evan Gershkovich was innocent of the charges that he faced, has now been freed as part of this prisoner exchange. Let's go to Washington, D.C. now and bring in our correspondent, James Matthews, who is following this all for us. So, look, James, this prisoner exchange is underway. The Wall Street Journal reporting that Evan Gershkovich is, of course, a part of it and has been freed and is now, I guess, on his way home. What's the reporting from there?
Yeah, that is one name amongst many. There are 4 in the frame in terms of American interests. Evan Gershkovich is one, Paul Whelan the other. He was also jailed for 16 years for espionage. There is a Russian-American citizen, a radio reporter. Her name is Alsu Kurmasheva, and there is also a Russian-British national who has an American green card and can legally live and work in this country. Indeed, he did latterly. And his name is Vladimir Kara-Murza, Cambridge educated. So they form part of this prisoner exchange, which involves a number of individuals going both ways and a number of countries in a deal brokered by President Biden. He was at the very heart of this, and the key to it seems to have been Germany, a Russian who was being held in Germany for a murder he committed in Berlin. His name is Vadim Karzikov, an FSB agent who killed an enemy of the Russian state. That's what he was sent there to do. In the phraseology of Vladimir Putin, he liquidated a bandit, essentially killed an individual who had a Chechnyan background and had fought against Russian forces. So he was serving more than 20 years in a German jail. A high-value individual, clearly in the eyes of the Russians. They wanted him back, and he was at the very heart of this exchange and the negotiations for the exchange. To secure the transfer of Karsakov, that's clearly a decision for the Germans, and the Americans negotiated that directly with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He was here for a meeting in February, and my understanding is that Biden and Scholz met. Scholz said to Biden, having received the request, "For you, I will do this." Biden turned to his aides sitting by his side and said, "Get it done." So, you know, almost a movie moment at the heart of all of this. And that was the nub of this deal, which has secured a number of prisoner releases on both sides. In terms of how things will play out over the next few hours, clearly there will be the transfer by plane. I'm at the White House. President Biden is preparing to meet the families of those who are being swapped. It's anticipated there will be phone contact, probably on the plane, with families and their loved ones who are on their way home. They'll be meeting with Biden, the families, and thereafter we expect to hear from the president himself. Clearly, a triumph for Joe Biden as he prepares to exit the Oval Office. We're led to believe that just an hour, no more than an hour before he announced that he wouldn't be running to be president in, next time around, he was making contact with his Slovenian counterpart as part of his efforts to stitch this deal together. So very much front and centre of Joe Biden's legacy, and that's the way it's being seen by those directly involved. There is an organisation called Families of American Hostages Abroad, and they are hailing Joe Biden's efforts in all of this. Biden, of course, and Kamala Harris, for them, it will not go unnoticed that Donald Trump, for long enough, has been promising that one of his first acts in office would be to secure the release of Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter, now on his way home. And his release, indeed, as I stand here at the White House, is being reported by his colleagues who for so long have campaigned for his release. There's a poster inside the press area here at the White House with Evan Gershkovich's face and with the slogan, "Journalism is not a crime, bring him home." Well, that's exactly what's happening now. He is on his way home along with a number of others.
He is indeed. All right, James, for now in DC, thank you for that. Let's bring in our Security and Defence Editor, Deborah Haynes, who's here with me in the studio for more on this and the significance of what we're seeing right now. Deb, just give us sort of a broad thought as to the significance of this moment as this exchange is underway.
I mean, given that it's against the backdrop of a time of intense hostilities between Russia and the West, with the war in Ukraine, fears of wider conflict, the two sides have clearly been locked in these back-channel negotiations right to the very top. US President Joe Biden, Vladimir Putin, you'd imagine, of course, would be very much involved in enabling this. And then the fact that it's at least 7 countries that have actually agreed to free prisoners as part of this extraordinary exchange. So Russia, Belarus on one side, and then the US, Germany, Poland, Slovenia and Norway on the other. And then Turkey acting as this kind of neutral ground almost in this sense with this. It really is kind of like echoes of the Cold War, seeing the aircraft on the tarmac and then the relief that's going to be felt, especially amongst those, the families of those who've been unfairly detained, like Evan Gershkovich. There are other journalists, there are dissidents that are being released by Russia. And then there are a convicted assassin on the other side going back to Russia. So risk and reward here.
OK. Deborah, thank you very much for that. Now, the United States, the State Department, have now confirmed the release of those detainees. Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal journalist, as well as Paul Whelan, who is a former US Marine. That is now being confirmed by the United States as the State Department thanks Turkey and Turkish officials for their part in facilitating this huge prisoner exchange. We're looking at pictures there of the capital of Turkey, Ankara, where we believe that this exchange is taking place. I think I can see a Russian-flagged jet there on the tarmac. Let's bring back in Deborah Haynes, our Security and Defence Editor. And Deborah, look, you were just getting to the point there that you were having, journalists exchange for a person convicted of an assassination of a Chechen in a Berlin park. I mean, there is a disparity in that, isn't there? What does that tell us about the decision-making in Moscow and Washington?
Obviously, in Moscow, they've painted those that they've detained as enemies of the state. And in fact, the Kremlin spokesperson has said, that enemies are now being ejected and, friends are being returned. Their friends, for example, this convicted assassin. It really does show there's clearly not just high stakes in terms of the politics and the diplomacy about this, but it is also just a reflection of the reality of this contested environment that we are now in, where, as I can remember, Jeremy Hunt, when he was Foreign Secretary back in 2018, when Paul Whelan, you mentioned him, a former US Marine who also has UK citizenship, Irish citizenship, Canadian citizenship, when he was detained on what the UK and the US have always said was trumped-up charges of spying. Jeremy Hunt was absolutely condemnatory of Russia at that time, saying that they are engaged in hostage diplomacy, using innocent civilians as leverage as part of grey zone warfare against their enemies. And, obviously on the West, for the US and others, they've had to make that calculation that this is the reality they're facing with. And do they let their civilians rot in a Russian jail, or do they actually engage in negotiations, agree to free people that they deem to be threats to the West and allow them to have their freedom back, and they've clearly calculated that is worth it in the longer scheme. And it's also interesting as well to see that this negotiation is taking place. It shows that these back channels that have always existed, including during the Cold War, they are still there. And again, you can imagine that within the framework of talking about prisoner exchanges, maybe they're able as well to talk about other issues, including the war in Ukraine and how that can be resolved.
Yeah. Deb, thanks you for that. Look, and as we said in the last few minutes, the United States have now acknowledged that this exchange is taking place. Some 16 people detained will be released. The spokesperson, the national security spokesperson, Jake Sullivan, has said that the agreement releases 16 people detained in Russia in exchange for 8 people held in the United States, Germany, Norway, Slovenia and Poland. Just reiterating the point that Deborah was making there a short while ago, that this is a widespread use of allies, nations that are allied, releasing prisoners that were held in exchange for those being held in Russia. Now, the editor of the Wall Street Journal, the editor-in-chief, Emma Tucker, has released a statement on behalf of the paper in response to the fact that Evan Gershkovich has now been released. Let me read you part of it here. It says, "Today is a joyous day for the safe return of our colleague Evan Gershkovich, who left a Russian aircraft moments ago in Turkey's capital, Ankara, as part of a prisoner swap with Russia. It's a joyous day for Evan's family, friends and colleagues who have worried about him and supported him these past 16 months. It's a joyous day for the millions of well-wishers in the US and around the world who stood with Evan and defended the free press. And it is a joyous day for the relatives and friends of the other wrongfully detained Americans and German citizens who returned home, and for the Russian political prisoners who were released to the West." It goes on. That it was done in a trade for a Russian operative guilty of serious crimes was predictable as the only solution given President Putin's cynicism. We are grateful to President Biden and his administration for working with persistence and determination to bring Evan home rather than see him shipped off to a Russian work camp for a crime that he did not commit. Now, 3 Americans and 1 legal permanent resident are to be returned to the US, as we have been saying. Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan, Aksu Kurmasheva and Vladimir Kara-Murza. Well, let's bring in our US correspondent, James Matthews, joining us from DC. And James, look, we've heard from the State Department, from the National Security spokesman, Jake Sullivan, confirming that this is now taking place. And I believe we're going to hear from the President sometime in the next hour or so.
Yeah, hi, Kamali. Expecting to hear from President Biden midday local time, so that's 40 minutes away. I think it might be worth, Kamali, just talking through some of the briefing notes that have been given to the media from the White House, which touches on the operation and the negotiations to secure the release of these prisoners, and some of the salient thoughts about the key players involved. This involves, we are told, 16 individuals currently detained in Russia, so they're coming out of Russia. 8 will be heading towards Russia, so that's the deal, 16 for 8. We're told that President Biden is going to meet with the families of the prisoners being released once we know that everybody is wheels up and safe and sound, according to the White House. If we're not at that stage, then clearly we're extremely close. And then it says we're going to hear from the President around midday. We know that in about 20 minutes or so we'll hear from President Biden in the stateroom. There are 4 people, individuals with ties to the United States: Paul Whelan, Evan Gershkovich, Aksu Kurmasheva, a radio journalist, and Vladimir Kara-Murza, who has a green card. He's actually a Russian-British national, Cambridge educated, a journalist, critic of Vladimir Putin, and his supporters say that's why he was being held prisoner. The administration here, the White House, has spoken about Germany's involvement and Germany being key to this prisoner swap because of Vadim Kara-Murza, the man who Vladimir Putin said liquidated a bandit. He killed an opponent of the regime, essentially, and was serving more than 20 years in a German jail. Russia wanted him home, a high-value individual in their eyes, the key to this. And then there's detail around a meeting with Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor. He was here in February. He and Biden talked about a range of matters, one of which was Karzikov. Olaf Scholz, we are told, looked President Biden in the eye and said, "For you, I will do this." Biden at that point turned to his aide sitting next to him and said, "Get this done." And it appears that this prisoner swap, that was the axis on which it turned, that meeting here in person in February. Now, according to this briefing, this is from the Biden administration, they're talking about Biden being on the phone literally an hour before he announced that he would not be running for the White House for a second term. He was on the phone to his Slovenian counterpart. We're told this. He was on the phone with his Slovenian counterpart, urging them to make the final arrangements and to get this deal over the line. But this is interesting. We're told by a senior administration official, and I'm quoting, "I would counsel anyone to be cautious in surmising from this that there is some sort of breakthrough in the relationship, or that it portends some détente with Russia or an easing of the tensions in our relationships. Our relationship, that is not going to be the case." So interesting that they caution against any interpretation that this warms relations with Russia. Essentially, this prisoner swap deal has been compartmentalized from discussions and the adversarial nature of relations with Moscow and ongoing concerns about Russian aggression and Russia's war in Ukraine. So that's the picture here, Kamali. As I say, we'll hear from the president. A short statement, we're led to believe, in about 20 minutes or so. He will be meeting with families of those who are leaving Russia. It would be a major surprise. We're not expecting to see them necessarily in person here. There will be much business for them to attend to. It may be that we see pictures, of course, but they're on their way home. Their families are on their way to the White House, and an air of celebration here, certainly an air of celebration in the offices of the Wall Street Journal in Washington, D.C., where we're told that cheers and applause broke out when they were told the confirmation that their colleague Evan Gershkovich was among those on his way home.
And you can imagine that. All right, James, for now in DC, thanks. For now, of course, more from you throughout the afternoon. As James was saying, we are expecting to hear from President Biden very shortly. That prisoner exchange is underway. 26 prisoners being exchanged in the Turkish capital, Ankara. It's being reported they're undergoing health checks and other procedures. That's according to Turkish security sources. Our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, is still here with us. Look, 26 prisoners being exchanged, Deb. It's a huge moment. You've got 16 prisoners coming from Russia and then 8 prisoners coming from Western nations. Talk to us about some of those individuals that are being exchanged at this point.
Yeah, so the numbers, we'll obviously have to get clarity on the numbers, won't we? Because Turkey's obviously saying 26, but from the US, they're talking about 24. You mentioned how from the Turkish statement, it also includes 2 minors. So maybe that would explain the discrepancy. But in terms of who, on the side of those being released by Russia, as we've been hearing, obviously the name that would have most recognition in the West is Evan Gershkovich, who was, it must be remembered, the first American journalist to be detained on allegations of espionage that he has and his employers and the US government have consistently denied since the Cold War. So that moment when he was arrested 16 months ago was a really chilling time for all journalists working in Russia. You'll remember following the outbreak of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Moscow, that people did choose to leave the country, concerned about the change in the law there, the absolute crackdown on any kind of dissent, even the language being used to report the war could get you in jail. And some of the other dissidents, according to Russia, the activists, the people who oppose Russia's regime, they are also amongst those being released, including potential political opponents. So that is a bit of a risk that Vladimir Putin has decided to take. And then, obviously, on the flip side, you've got as we've been focusing on, in particular, this convicted assassin who was detained in Germany. It was a big moment. Germany has been the site of a lot of Russian attacks and hostilities, and this individual, he shot a Chechen rebel, someone wanted by the Russian regime, in a Berlin park, was then arrested, found guilty, convicted. But clearly his release has been an absolute cornerstone to unlocking everything else, and that is moving into place, and that's what we're seeing now.
And Germany has got a large role to play in this, as James was saying, as you're pointing out, there are 12 German nationals and Russian political prisoners reported to be going back to Germany, including Kevin Lick, Rico Krieger, who I think is being released from Belarus back to Germany, and Kesnia Fadeyeva. Now, that may not be a name that's very familiar to many of our viewers, but she was an activist who worked alongside Alexei Navalny. And, of course, there was a moment before he died in that prison that Alexei Navalny was being discussed about being exchanged.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we heard from his widow, who was speaking after his death earlier this year. Remember, he'd been convicted, was serving a decades-long sentence, and then suddenly mysteriously died in captivity, that his name had been talked about as part of a prisoner exchange. And I mean, that obviously, so it's going to be a painful moment as well, you'd imagine, for his relatives, seeing what's happening and thinking what could have been. But also, it really does underline that sense of urgency and the motivation on the side of Germany, of the US and others that have been involved in securing this release, to be willing to kind of pinch their noses and release individuals who pose a threat to the West, allow them to return to Russia in exchange for their citizens whose freedom they've been fighting for.
And James sort of alluded to it there. Give us a sense behind the curtain as these negotiations are going on. You know, Olaf Scholz looking directly at President Biden and saying, for you, I will do this. And as we say, 12 people going to Germany as a part of this exchange, German nationals, but also, I guess, Russian nationals as well that may have German citizenship as well. What does it tell us about Germany's role in some of these negotiations? Well,
I mean, Germany, it's a long history. Before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Germany was one of the countries within NATO that still had fairly clear, very close ties with Russia, often to the dismay of countries like the UK. You'll remember there was like a big Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Yep. There was a lot of money and finances and relations as well. You'll remember Angela Merkel. She sort of grew up in East Germany behind the Iron Curtain. She always had a particular, an ability to talk to Putin, to Vladimir Putin, that other Western leaders didn't have. And so clearly Germany, especially given that they were holding one of these key assets in their jails, had to play a part. But I think we're getting a little glimpse of this extensive conversations and backroom discussions that have been going on. Yes, you've had it at the leaders' level, but you can well imagine that intelligence officers, military officers, diplomats behind the scenes for months, years, have been working on a deal as complex as what we're seeing unfold right now, and against the backdrop of a war in Ukraine, relations between the two sides at the worst they've been since the height of the Cold War. And yes, the White House is cautioning, don't read into the fact that we've been willing to deal with Russia as meaning that it's going to be an entente cordiale and we're going to be friends again. However, it is important to note that the fact that they are able to talk in a way to secure a release like this just shows that they are able still, despite the hostilities, to deal with incredibly sensitive matters. I mean, even if it does go through intermediaries, it's very important to realise that there is that discussion ongoing. Deborah, look, from the names that we've got and the numbers that are being exchanged here on either side, are we able at this point to sort of see who's getting the better deal as a result of this? I mean, I guess from the US side, you'll have President Biden in the last few months of his presidency wanting to have a win and bring American citizens home. I mean, Olaf Scholz is under pressure in Germany as well. Maybe he wants to be seen to have a political win here as well. And Vladimir Putin, of course, would have wanted to see that he's got a win by getting these Russian citizens back. Well, I think that's got to be the genius behind a negotiation like this, is that both sides can say to their people that they got the win. Otherwise it doesn't work. And at the moment, there isn't a particular leverage on either side that would have meant that one had more power over the other. Clearly, both sides were holding individuals that the other side wanted. And so, yes, for President Biden, he can now, and we will be hearing from him very soon, this is a victory, a triumph for him that he's managed to bring these American citizens home. Evan Gershkovich, in particular, has been a huge, his capture, his detention and his treatment has been a huge issue inside the United States of massive anger. And so he will be able to, especially since the president, former President Trump has said that would be one of the things that he would achieve, once he gets in, if he got back into office, so that Joe Biden can say that he's secured this in his final months. So that will be a victory. But for Vladimir Putin, he will be able to say to his people that he's managed to bring home, people who he regards as heroes who have been fighting for the motherland. So I think it's a case where both sides will want to say that they've won.
That's perhaps why it takes so long to try and secure, because you've got to make sure that you get the equal balance on either side. Look, in the last few minutes, the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal, the paper that Evan Gershkovich works for, has said that he has left a Russian aircraft in the Turkish capital, Ankara. So Evan Gershkovich will now be on his way home. He, of course, was jailed in Russia just a month or so ago on espionage charges that the Wall Street Journal, the US State Department, and, of course, Evan Gershkovich himself had denied, seen as trumped-up charges, but used, I guess, as part of a pawn in this kind of hostage diplomacy. And the fear, I guess, would be, and you were making this point earlier, Deb, to Sir Andrew Wood, that once these deals are done and people are released in terms of these agreements, that this kind of hostage-taking can continue, because I guess you don't stop it by releasing them.
No, you don't. But clearly, like we were saying, there's a calculation that goes on, isn't there? And clearly, for the US and Germany and the others involved in this, they calculated that it was absolutely worth getting their people out, given the system in Russia under Vladimir Putin at the moment is so hostile. The fact that they brazenly went out and arrested Evan Gershkovich and others in the first place on these trumped-up charges, according to their employers, it really sent this chilling message to other journalists working in Russia, to citizens with foreign nationalities, British passport holders, US passport holders living in the country. And so, yes, while clearly they're able to negotiate that, there will also be on their mind that this is maybe just proving that these pawns, this kind of like hostage diplomacy works. And it's not just Russia where you see this happening. It happens in China. It happens in Iran. We know there's been, British citizens held in Iran, still being held in Iran, and deals to negotiate their release have also been incredibly fraught and a part of a form of warfare that takes place in the grey zone. It's not open conflict, but it's a way that countries that are hostile to one another can use the other country's citizens as hostages to try to secure leverage and to gain some kind of advantage. Yeah, absolutely. All right, Deborah Haynes, our Security and Defence Editor, thank you very much for that for now. So, look, that developing story, the unfolding story this afternoon, that there is a prisoner exchange ongoing at the moment, some 26 prisoners being exchanged between the West and Russia. 3 Americans and 1 legal permanent resident are to be returned to the United States. They are the journalists Evan Gershkovich, who works for the Wall Street Journal, Paul Whelan, a former US Marine, Alsu Kurmasheva, a journalist, and Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is also a journalist. Deborah Haynes, just quickly. So the family of Paul Whelan have just released a statement about thanking him for his release, and thanking people for covering the situation, and obviously we can read more about that later. Yeah, the families will be delighted. We'll have plenty more in the next hour of the show. Mark Austin will be taking over in a few minutes' time.
4 prisoners from jails in 7 different countries, including the US and Russia, conducted in huge secrecy, and after months of diplomatic wrangling, the swap took place in Turkey, and this evening the prisoners are on their way home. 3 Americans and 1 legal permanent resident are being returned to the United States. Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan, a former Marine, Alsu Kurmasheva, a Russian-American journalist, and also, as you see there on the right, Vladimir Kara-Murza, a known critic of President Putin. 12 German nationals will return home after being held as political prisoners in Russia. In return, 8 people will return to Russia from the US, Germany, Slovenia, Norway and Poland. Among them, Vadim Krasikov, a hitman, assassin, who was detained in Berlin. Well, our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, is with me. Well, Deborah, this is a big deal in many ways.
It's an extraordinary deal, and clearly one that that has taken an awful long time to get across the line. And the release of Vadim Krasikov, this Russian assassin, absolutely pivotal. And actually, just now, the German government has confirmed his release and said that it was not an easy decision, and said that their obligation was to protect German nationals held in Russia, and also in solidarity with the United States. And that was the key motivation for enabling this. But you're obviously seeing, on the one hand, journalists like Evan Gershkovich. He was the first American journalist since the Cold War to be arrested and detained and then convicted of espionage charges that he has consistently denied, along with the US government and his employers, in exchange for a convicted murderer. And so clearly calculations made in the West, also in Moscow, about the reality of what they're facing with this intense hostility at the moment, and realising that the only way to move forward was to make this uncomfortable deal.
Yeah, the Americans are apparently saying that Putin would not agree to the deal unless this assassin, this hitman, Vadim Krasikov, an FSB hitman, was part of that deal. So he's clearly very important to Vladimir Putin. He was the deal breaker in all this. But, Deborah, the other side of this is wonderful news for the families of Gershkovich and Kara-Murza.
Absolutely extraordinary. And Paul Whelan as well. He was this former US Marine, also a British national. Yeah. He's got UK, Canadian, Irish and American citizenship. He was detained back in 2018. And I remember Jeremy Hunt, who was Foreign Secretary at the time, accusing Moscow back then of hostage diplomacy, demanding his release. And here we are, more than 2,000 days later, with him finally enjoying his freedom too. Evan Gershkovich, there's been a huge campaign to rally for his release. This young journalist in Russia, doing journalism, it's not a crime, reporting for his newspaper, and then being arrested 16 months ago. And you can just imagine the relief of his family, friends, colleagues, when they do see him. But the fact that he is now out of Russia will be a huge relief.
Yeah, and the Russian-American journalist Alsu Kurmasheva, 47 years old. 2
children. Unable to speak to her children during her time in detention.
Yeah, doesn't bear thinking about. But they are free this evening. In a moment, we'll speak to James Matthews at the White House. But first to Ivor Bennett in Moscow. And Ivor, I just wonder, isn't this just going to persuade Putin that this is worth it, that taking foreigners and taking foreign journalists and imprisoning them is worth it?
Yeah, I think that's the fear, isn't it? Because it almost, in some cases, validates and shows that his strategy is working. What the West calls hostage diplomacy, they've accused Russia repeatedly of using people like Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan as human bargaining chips. And given the extent of this deal, so many countries involved, resulting even in the return of a convicted hitman, a convicted killer, Vladimir Kara-Murza, it shows, as you say, that strategy does work. And despite all the differences between Russia and the West, they can still come to an agreement. Joe Biden, the US president, Germany can also move as well from their stance. Despite all their disagreement over Ukraine and despite being arch enemies when it comes to the war in Ukraine, they can still reach an agreement on this front. So that then begs the question, could we see this happen again from Vladimir Putin? Because all these, so many foreign and dual nationals in Russian prisons, as well as prominent Russian prisoners, human rights activists, opposition figures, they've now been released. Will this mean that Vladimir Putin might feel emboldened, might start imprisoning more foreigners? We don't know, but that's the reason why the United States government warns its citizens not to travel to Russia for this very reason. I think the big question is why now, of course. I think you'll probably get to that with James Matthews in the States, but I think the key timing here was the US election coming up in November. I think Russia might see potential shift in administration as a risk to undoing all the work that's been done behind the scenes, because not only is this a big win for the Biden administration, Russia will portray this as a big win for them as well. The fact that they can get people like Vladimir Kara-Murza home, and it almost shows that they'll use this, I think, to say that, look, despite what the West was saying that Evan Gershkovich was not a spy, look, they have actually wanted to trade him for what they say are spies, Russian spies in the US. So I think this will embolden Russia certainly, and they'll play this as a big win on their side.
And, well, James, the Americans he's at the White House there, and the Americans very clearly at the heart of this. And I suppose we can say something of a coup for President Biden now, you know, a president looking for a legacy.
Yeah, and I think this will be very much at the heart of that legacy, Mark. I think we're expecting to hear from President Biden in the state dining room at the White House in the next few minutes. I mean, this is Biden's victory lap, having spent months, indeed years, stitching together this plan. It's something he has had a personal stake in. I remember being at the White House Correspondents' Dinner something like 18 months ago. The guests of honor that night were the parents of Evan Gershkovich. Biden was giving the main speech. He asked them to stand up and take a round of applause and made the pledge to them that night. Journalism is not a crime, he said. I will do everything I can to bring your son home. He has been at it throughout his term in office, strenuous efforts to secure the release of Gershkovich and others. Indeed, Mark, there is detail being related from inside the State Department that gives an indication, or an insight certainly, into some of the American efforts. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, he was having discussions about how they could make the Russians move. The Russians weren't interested unless this Vadim Karsakov, this assassin in Berlin, was involved in any prisoner swap. So the Americans tried to get the Germans interested in enlarging the scale of any swap. They suggested, the Americans, to the Germans that Alexei Navalny, the now deceased Russian opposition leader, be part of any kind of deal. The Russian foreign minister at the time wasn't interested, had a number of issues with it, thought Navalny would probably just return to Russia, so that trail went cold. Ultimately, the Americans elevated it to the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. It culminated in a meeting between Scholz and Biden here at the White House in February, during which Olaf Scholz said to Biden, "For you, I will do this." Biden turned to his US aide by his side and said, "Get this done." So that was the square-jawed movie moment at the heart of all of this. But in terms of the timing, clearly it works for Biden in terms of legacy. I think the timing is key to all of this. The Russians would have been looking at this deal, the potential to bring home their high-value national from Germany, a deal stitched together with the Biden administration. There is going to be a change of personnel in the Oval Office, so they would have seen the potential for that deal unravelling. And to that extent, perhaps that plays in to the Russians thinking the timing was right to make this happen. But as I say, we'll hear from Biden shortly. He's gathering with the families of those who are being swapped, the American families in the White House. Whether or not we hear from them, we'll see in due course. But clearly a mood of some celebration in the White House, not just in the White House itself, but also in the press room. Of course, colleagues here are reporting on the freedom of one of their colleagues. There's a poster up in the press room, picture of Evan Gershkovich with the slogan beneath, "Journalism is not a crime, bring him home." Well, that's exactly what's happening right now.
Yeah, and James, I'm just seeing a statement from Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, who says Paul Whelan, Evan Gershkovich and Alsu Kurmasheva are on their way back to the United States from Russia through the extraordinary efforts of countless people in the State Department and across our government. The United States was able to strike an agreement to secure their freedom, as well as that of Vladimir Kara-Murza and 12 others held inside Russia. He then talks about their gratitude for the support from other countries involved in this. And then he says, through many difficult conversations over the past several years, I told the families of those wrongfully detained, he makes the point, in Russia, that we wouldn't forget them. I know there are many times over those years where they have wondered if our work would ever bear fruit. I also know they never gave up hope, nor did we. And then he says, under President Biden's leadership, we have secured the release of dozens of Americans who were held hostage or wrongfully detained. My pledge to the families of those still separated from their families is the same that I made to those returning home today. We will not forget you. We will not rest until you see your loved ones again. So clearly, and I'm sure Antony Blinken and the State Department have played a key role in this, but clearly they're keen to make a political point here as well, James.
You're absolutely right, Mark. Yeah, I mean, it's backslapping all round, and who's to say they don't deserve it? Considerable efforts have gone into this achievement, which is some achievement after years of effort. The Americans, I might say, are acknowledging that it's less than optimal, the fact that you have this Russian assassin being released from a jail in Germany, serving more than 20 years for a horrific assassination on the streets of Berlin. But the Americans' response, when questioned about that, is that, in order to secure the release, they say, of innocent people overseas, innocent Americans, you have to make some tough decisions. You have to make some tough calls. And the official who is relating this sentiment, he goes on to say that we'll be keeping an eye on those who have been released and sent back to Russia, and keeping an eye on their activities. We will be vigilant to those activities, and they'll be held accountable for any crimes in future. Quite spurious sentiment, given the possibilities that they'll come back into contact with these particular individuals, I suppose. But an acknowledgement from the Americans that there's a lot about this that is not ideal, but ultimately the rewards outweigh the downside in all of it. And, Biden, we'll hear his statement fairly shortly in the next few minutes. It is central to his legacy. It is a result in which he has been personally invested, not least because he had Donald Trump shouting from the sidelines. Part of his election campaign, of course, has been muscular foreign policy, how he would play differently in terms of the politics with Vladimir Putin and foreign adversaries. Central to that has been his promise, his pledge that Evan Gershkovich would be freed in short order should Donald Trump be elected to the White House for a second term. Well, I suppose that goes away in terms of how that plays into the Biden-Harris versus Trump politics. It's a result for Joe Biden. And we'll hear, of course, the human story at the heart of it all. The politicians have stitched this deal together, but, there are human beings at the heart of it, humans on planes back to the United States and elsewhere right now. The families of those individuals being invited to the White House. They'll meet with Joe Biden inside the Oval Office, and we'll get a sense of what their reaction is to what's happened. We've had a statement from the family of Paul Whelan, his brother, who has dealt with the media over many years while Paul Whelan has been detained in Moscow. And, you know, with some levity, he announces at the top of the statement, "This will be my last statement," as the media point man for a brother imprisoned by the Russians. I think we're about to hear from Joe Biden fairly shortly. His speech on paper being laid on the lectern is the sign that
he's coming now, James. So we'll thank you very much. We'll have a listen to President Biden.
You got everybody? Well, good afternoon. And this is a very good afternoon. A very good afternoon. Today we're bringing home Paul, Evan, also Vladimir. 3 American citizens and 1 American green card holder. All 4 have been imprisoned unjustly in Russia. Paul for nearly 6 years. Vladimir since 2022. Evan since March of 2023. And Alsu since October of 2023. Russian authorities arrested them, convicted them in show trials, and sentenced them to long prison terms with absolutely no legitimate reason whatsoever, none. Paul, a former Marine, was in Russia for a wedding. Evan, a journalist with a Russian in Russia, was in Russia, signed by the Wall Street Journal. Alsu, also a journalist, was in Russia to see family. All 3 falsely accused of being spies. And Vladimir was a Russian citizen by birth and holds an American green card. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and was a pallbearer at my friend John McCain's funeral with me. He spoke out against Putin's regime, and for that he was convicted of treason. And now their brutal ordeal is over, and they're free. Moments ago, the families and I were able to speak to them on the telephone from the Oval Office. They're out of Russia. Earlier today, they were flown to Turkey, and soon they'll be wheels up on their way home to see their families. This is an incredible relief for all the family members gathered here. It's relief to the friends and colleagues all across the country who've been praying for this day for a long time. The deal that made this possible was a feat of diplomacy and friendship. Friendship. Multiple countries helped get this done. They joined the difficult, complex negotiations at my request. And I personally thank them all again. And I've thanked them personally, and I'll thank them again. All told, Russia has released 16 prisoners. 8 Russians who are being held in the West will be sent home as well. These 16 prisoners from Russia that Russia has released include 4 Americans, 5 Germans, 7 Russian citizens who are political prisoners in their own country. One of those Russians runs a human rights organization, Memorial, which won a Nobel Prize in 2022. Putin threw him in prison for voicing opposition to the war in Ukraine. 4 others work with Alexei Navalny, a political opposition leader who died in Russia prison this year. Now they can live safely abroad and continue their work of advocating for democracy if they so choose. This deal would not have been made possible without our allies. Germany, Poland, Slovenia, Norway, and Turkey, they all stepped up, and they stood with us. They stood with us. And they made bold and brave decisions, released prisoners being held in their countries who were justifiably being held, and provided logistical support to get the Americans home. So for anyone who questions whether allies matter, they do. They matter. And today is a powerful example of why it's vital to have friends in this world. Friends you can trust, work with, and depend upon, especially on matters of great consequence and sensitivity like this. Our alliances make our people safer, and we began to see that again today. Let me say this. It says a lot about the United States that we work relentlessly to free Americans who are unjustly held around the world. It also says a lot about us that this deal includes the release of Russian political prisoners. They stood up for democracy and human rights. Their own leaders threw them in prison. The United States helped secure their release as well. That's who we are in the United States. We stand for freedom, for liberty, for justice. not only for our own people, but for others as well. And that's why all Americans can take pride in what we've achieved today. I want to thank everyone in my administration who helped make this happen. Our work did not start just on day one. It started before day one. During the transition, I instructed our national security team to dig into all the cases of hostages being wrongfully detained, which were inherently, well, we inherited them from the prior administration. I wanted to make sure we hit the ground running, and we did. As of today, my administration has brought home over 70 Americans who were wrongfully detained and held hostage abroad, many since before I took office. Additionally, I issued an executive order in 2022 authorizing penalties like sanctions and travel bans on those who hold Americans against their will. And my State Department has introduced new warnings for Americans about the risk of being wrongfully detained by a foreign government. Deals like this one come with tough calls, and there are never any guarantees. But there's nothing that matters more to me than protecting Americans at home and abroad. And so we'll continue to work for the release of all wrongfully detained Americans around the world. Let me end where I began, with Paul, Evan, and also Vladimir and their families. They never gave up hope. We can't imagine what they've been through, all of you. Matter of fact, this lady right here, I think, was living in the Oval Office with us for a while. All kidding aside, can't imagine their joy right now. They're home. Tomorrow's a big day. The 13th birthday of Miriam. Miriam, where are you? Come here. You all know we have a tradition in the Biden family. We sing happy birthday on any birthday. You ready? All of you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Miriam. Happy birthday to you. Remember, no serious guys till you're 30. God love you. She's Alsu's daughter. Now she gets to celebrate with her mom. That's what this is all about. Families able to be together again, like they should have been all along. So I want to thank you again to everyone who did their part. In just a few hours, we'll welcome home our fellow Americans. We're looking forward to that. God willing, we're going to be out at Andrews and get that done. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And this is a good day.
What did you say to them on the phone, sir? What did you say when they answered the phone on the other side?
I said, welcome almost home.
How do you keep countries, these so-called abductor states, from simply taking more Americans in order to get more of their prisoners home? How do you end these perverse incentives, sir?
Well, we're advising people not to go certain places. Tell them what's at risk, what's at stake.
Mr. President, there are these negotiations, and can you speak to the complexity of working with 6 countries to secure these releases?
Well, look, I'm not going to take the time now, but I'll do this later in the week. I particularly own a great sense of gratitude to the Chancellor. The demands they were making to me required me to get some significant concessions from Germany, which they originally concluded they could not do because of the person in question. But everybody stepped up. Poland stepped up, Slovenia stepped up, Turkey stepped up. And it matters to have relationships. It really does. These things matter. Pardon me?
Could this improve relations with Russia? Is there any avenue for that after this prisoner exchange deal?
As my sister might say, your lips to God's ears, man.
Did you ever speak with Vladimir Putin about this, or would you be willing to speak with Putin now directly?
I don't need to speak with Putin.
Anyway. How did you weigh that decision of letting somebody out who sounds like got away with murder tonight?
I got home innocent people. Thank you. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Are you speaking with Erdogan or any of the leaders about this?
Say that again?
Are you speaking with President Erdogan or the leaders about this?
Yes, I've spoken to all the leaders about this.
What did you say?
And by the way, as a father, look, you heard me say this before. I mean it. My dad had a simple proposition. Family is the beginning, the middle, and the end. Blood of my blood, bone of my bone. I can think of nothing more consequential. I mean it sincerely. And having lost family, not a different way, and not knowing what's happening, the circumstance with their accident, with health, it matters.
Mr. President, what did Germany ask for in response for their cooperation?
Nothing.
President Trump
President Trump has said repeatedly that he could have gotten the hostages out without giving anything in exchange. What do you say to that? What do you say to President Trump now, former president?
Why didn't he do it when he was president?
Sir, what did you
Thank you guys.
Well, there we go. President Biden in a good mood. And just to explain what was going on there, he was surrounded by the families of 3 of those detained. To his right was the family of Alsu Kermasheva, and the happy birthday thing was because Miriam, the daughter, young daughter, was celebrating her birthday. To the left of the president was the family of Evan Gershkovich, and further along was the family of Vladimir Kara-Murza. So that explains that. What did he say? He said, good afternoon, and it was a good afternoon, or it is a good afternoon. We are bringing them home, he said. They were imprisoned for no legitimate reason whatsoever, none. All were accused of being spies. Now their ordeal is over. They are out of Russia. They are free. Soon they will be wheels up to home. And then he went on about this, what he called a feat of diplomacy, complex negotiations. There you see the families. Complex negotiations at my request, he said. And our friendly countries stood up and supported us, talking there about Germany, who had to be pressured to release the key guy in all this, which is the FSB hitman, Vadim Krasikov, who was on his way now back to Russia. But he said the friendly countries stood up and supported us. Allies matter. And then as he was leaving, he was asked, what did you say to Putin? Did you say anything? And he said, I don't need to speak to Putin. Let's have a quick word with James Matthews, who is outside the White House. And James, I mean, this was a president, first of all, very happy, a president claiming the credit. And when he talked to the freed prisoners, he said, welcome almost home.
Yeah, that's right. I thought Joe Biden looked and performed better than we have seen him for some time, Mark. Perhaps now that the pressure's off, that frees him to talk freely and be less constrained in terms of his public performance. But, yeah, clearly he had good news to relate. It almost felt like part of the Joe Biden, the legacy tour. And, of course, this will be at the heart of the legacy. He spoke about how countries had joined difficult, complex negotiations at my request. They stepped up and stood with us, making it clear that America was very much at the heart of this process of stitching together the prisoner swap deal. So leaving nobody in any doubt that he was at the heart of it. And he also touched on the fact that, you know, while saying that we stand for freedom, liberty and justice, he talked about how allies matter, important to have friends in this world, he said. For me, that was a nod to his foreign policy expertise and experience over the years. That has always been seen as Joe Biden's strong point, working contacts around the world. Of course, we're at a stage where he has been seen to fail in important arenas like the Middle East. It's been shaky in terms of Russia and Ukraine. So little wonder that he is quite happy to trumpet this as his and America's achievement. In practical terms, we saw the human story in all of this, didn't we? Young Miriam being chorused with happy birthday. She'll celebrate that with her mother. In terms of the practicalities, they've had their meeting with the president, these families. They've had the phone call with their loved ones on the plane on their way home. And he spoke about going to the Joint Base Andrews. That's the Air Force Base in Maryland. It's about an hour away from here, something like that. So that would tend to indicate that that's where they are going to land in the next few hours. Not clear whether or not the president himself is going to welcome them off the plane, but clearly we're in that wheels up situation, a time for the president to celebrate, a time for many to celebrate, not least colleagues and friends of the journalist Evan Gershkovich. We're told, Gershkovich, his colleagues in the DC office of the Wall Street Journal, we're told, cheered and applauded when news of his confirmed release came through.
James, thank you very much indeed. I just want to explain to viewers who has been released here, or the 4 Americans, certainly, that Joe Biden was talking about. And we have a picture of the 4 Americans who are released. And there on the left, Paul Whelan, who's 54 years old, a former US Marine, sentenced to 16 years on spying charges. That was back in 2018. Next to him, Alsu Kurmasheva, 47 years old, a Russian-American journalist with 2 children, detained in October 2023 in Russia. And then Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal journalist, convicted of spying in Moscow, set to be freed, has been freed today in one of the biggest releases of prisoners since the Cold War. And then finally, Vladimir Kara-Murza, a dual British-Russian citizen and a prominent critic of President Putin, who was sentenced to 25 years in prison on treason charges. Gershkovich had been detained for 500 days. So those are the 4 that President Biden was talking about. And Deborah Haynes is with me. And it does seem, the story emerging is that Putin was persuaded to do this because there was this agreement by Germany in the end to release this Vadim Krasikov, convicted of assassinating an enemy of Putin in Berlin.
Yeah, convicted back, the murder was in 2019, and President Biden then really kind of making that point, didn't he, about how the agreement by the Chancellor Olaf Scholz to overcome, there was clearly a reluctance on the German side to free a man that had murdered somebody on German soil. But again, the US president was sort of making that point about how he has those friendships, he has those relationships, he has those allies and that ability to influence, and clearly managed to convince Germany to overcome their reservations and agree to freeing a convicted murderer, which clearly unlocked the whole exchange. And he was asked, wasn't he, as he was exiting, what Germany got in return from the US for agreeing to free the assassin, and he said nothing. And again, that kind of reiterates that idea. And it felt almost like it was a sort of a slight on Donald Trump, who has, by contrast, really undermined the NATO alliance consistently. Joe Biden there really making the point that allies matter. And I thought as well, the interesting thing that he said was, it wasn't just Americans, German nationals, the dual British-Russian national who was freed. It was also 7 Russian citizens, including political prisoners who had been working with the opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, who have also been released as part of this exchange. And you can only imagine that potentially, had Alexei Navalny survived, that he might have also, we know that his name was being discussed, wasn't it, as part of a potential exchange, but obviously, sadly, he perished.
But it does not mean they're safe from harm by Russia, because I'm just reading here that 14 years ago, a prisoner swap involved Sergei Skripal.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the last
released by Moscow,
swap,
and convicted of spying, and then of course they were targeted by the Kremlin later on, the Novichok thing. So
yeah, that was the one where it was 2010, and it was an exchange in Vienna at the international airport there for those 10 Russian spies, including Anna Chapman, who'd been detained by the United States. And yes, Sergei Skripal released, freed, enjoying his freedom, only to be hunted down 8 years later, along with his daughter, and poisoned with Novichok. So, yes, absolutely, you're right to point that out, that in particular the Russian citizens. They might be free, but whether or not they'll be safe, they probably won't feel too safe.
No. Deborah, just stay with us. And Peter Ricketts is joining us. Lord Ricketts, former National Security Advisor. And good to talk to you, Peter. And, well, first of all, just the historic nature of this exchange.
Yes, the largest probably since the Cold War. I mean, it does take you back to a John le Carré spy novel, doesn't it? The Cold War antics of having to negotiate for an exchange like this with a country which is still very much an adversary. You can feel, of course, the joy for the families, for those who are coming home. It's a great moment for Joe Biden. It is something he's been working on for several years. He's taking all the credit for that. But there is the downside to it, as Deborah was just pointing out. The price for getting the Americans and the other Western nationals home and the Russian dissidents was to release this man, Krasikov, who was convicted in Germany for murder. He was serving a life sentence, and he goes home free to Russia. And the problem with this kind of swap, therefore, is that it says to the Kremlin, if you've got a spy convicted in the West and you want him home, well, collect a few bargaining chips of Westerners who are clearly innocent and frame them and detain them, and then one day you can trade them against the spy you want home. This is the problem. There are wonderful human dimensions to it, very positive, but there is also that underlying rather darker aspect to what's going on today.
Because, as you say, we can see clearly now why Gershkovich was taken, why he was put through the Russian criminal justice system, and where it was all inevitably going to go, although, of course, the family didn't know it was going to inevitably end like this.
No, you're quite right. And, nothing can detract from, what the family have got back. They've got back their loved one, Joe Biden's achievement. But the risk is it makes life more dangerous for journalists, for charity workers, for people working in NGOs, in exposed places in countries that are or could become adversaries. It's just one of the facts of life. Foreign policy is a difficult business. There are these trade-offs. There is clearly a trade-off. It was downplayed, of course, in what Joe Biden said, but he did just about mention it. For him, the prize was well worth the cost. But I can imagine if Krasikov had been detained in the UK, we would have real problems in releasing somebody on a life sentence for murder in a prisoner exchange. So this was a big effort by the Germans as well to do something which they knew was very important to Joe Biden and the administration.
And with that in mind, just try and give us a sense of the kind of diplomatic heavy lifting that would be going on. Not least the Americans trying to persuade the Germans to release this guy Krasikov.
It's been a very complex deal, clearly. It seems to have been put together essentially by the Turks, who are in a position as members of NATO to have a good relationship with Washington, but also be quite close to Russia. Putin has a good relationship with Erdogan. So they've, I think, been the brokers who've been assembling this deal. And it will mostly have been done through intelligence agencies, I would think. I mean, that's probably the channel. There's not a lot of front channel dealings between Washington and Moscow. And yes, there will have been some very tough talks with the Germans. They will have found that very difficult to release this man. There may be other Russians going home as well from other prisons around Europe that we have heard less about. In the end, it was obviously, a decision by Scholz that the relationship with America was so important over Ukraine, for example, and the future of NATO, that it was worth paying this price and finding a way through the German legal system, no idea how they did that, to allow this man to be released in exchange. It was clearly a calculated deal, and it shows the importance that Germany attaches to the relationship and probably to giving Joe Biden, something that was very important to him in the last months of his presidency.
Lord Ricketts, thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme. And Deborah, we're going to take a break in a second, but just sum this up. It's a surprising deal, a significant deal.
Historic and extraordinary, especially against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine and intense hostilities between the West and Russia. Back, you talked about 2010, the release of Sergei Skripal in a similar prisoner exchange. But at those times, relations between the two sides were, there was almost this attempt to kind of revive them. And we've been told from the White House that people should not read into the fact that there was a willingness to negotiate for the prisoner swap as meaning that there could potentially be a warming of ties. Instead, this is very much back to the Cold War era of two sides deeply hostile to one another. And yet also it does show an ability for them to communicate and to be able to navigate such a complex negotiation as a prisoner swap, and one as complex as this, with 7 countries involved in terms of releasing people. So I think from that you can draw that, yes, while the two sides remain intensely hostile, they clearly do have an established and functioning back channel of communication, which can only be a good thing.